scenario, there has been a slowdown in the Indian economy. Part of it is because of the global economy itself slowing down. You see here the world, the advanced economies, the emerging economies, and all groups of countries have actually slowed down in 2019 when compared to the averages for 2014 to 2018. In a globalized economy, India has also felt that effect. But there is one important aspect on which I will delve into greater detail, which needs attention from the perspective of the Indian economy, which is the financial sector. This chart shows the share of corporate loans in non-fruit credit starting from 2007 to 2019. What is quite relevant here to notice is this boom and bust, with 2013 being the peak when the share of corporate loans reached their peak. After that, it has decreased. Now, what is the impact of this on investment? If you want to understand the impact of this on investment, we can do the following exercise, which is take a 10-year period, split it into two 5-year halves, look at the credit that a firm takes in the first 5 years, and then correlate it with the investment that the firm does in the next half. Now, if suppose the credit that they've taken actually is affecting investment negatively in the next 5-year period, then you should see a negative correlation with 2013 as being the break year. And that is the exercise that is being shown in the table. This is the result from regressions that we've run. What you see clearly is that it is indeed 2013 and the 10-year period from 2008 to 2017 where there is this negative correlation. In other words, firms that actually borrowed a lot more from 2008 to 2012, where indeed the firms that also actually invested less from 2013 to 2017. Now, how does this affect GDP growth? As we had showed in the last economic survey on the virtuous cycle originates from private investment, which affects economic growth with a lag, and thereby consumption, and that's how the virtuous cycle proceeds. Now, what is important here is what is being shown on the right, which is the correlation of investment with GDP growth, with both contemporaneously and with lags. I want you to pay particular attention to the one that is being shown with the arrow, which is the correlation with a 4-year lag, which is what is the impact on GDP growth this year due to the investment done 4 years back. That has a very strong positive correlation. If you look at the contemporaneous correlation, which is being shown in black, that is negative. Now, this is important for us to understand because as I just showed, the peak of the credit happened in 2013, and after that there has been actually a decline in credit, which has affected investment as well, and it's that 4-year lag as a result of which the slowdown in investment has led to the growth slide starting from 2017 onwards. Now, it is in this context that we actually focus in this year's economic survey on the theme of wealth creation. Wealth is both a cause and an effect of investment, especially private investment. Therefore, it is important for us to focus on wealth creation. In this context, it is quite pertinent to go back and look at the history, the recorded economic history. This chart shows that for close to 3/4 of recorded economic history, India has been the dominant economic power in the world. So this chart goes from 180 to 2017. Obviously, the first 1,000 years are actually not up to scale. 1 to 1,000 is being shown in a smaller period on the x-axis. But what is critical here is that for 3/4 of recorded economic history, India has been the dominant economic power. Such dominance does not happen by mere chance. Such dominance happens by design. And what is that element of design? It is indeed our emphasis on wealth. If you think about what our traditions say for the 4 noble human pursuits, which is dharma, arth, kam, moksha, arth is indeed about wealth. The canonical example, the canonical literature that is talked about is Arthashastra, but even many of our other ancient traditions also advocate wealth as wealth and wealth creation as indeed a noble pursuit. A very important piece of Tamil literature, which is the Tirukkural, talks about this in the chapter 76. Wealth, the lamp unfailing, speeds to every land, dispensing darkness at its Lord's command. Now that is ancient thought, but how does that correlate with evidence that we have in recent times? To provide contemporary evidence on this, the exercise that we've done is to look at the top 100 entrepreneurs as measured using the Forbes list as of 2019, looked at the wealth that they've created over the last 10 years, applied necessary filters to ensure that the wealth was created in the right way, and correlated it with various other aspects of society. In this chart, what you see is that as there is an increase in the wealth created by our entrepreneurs, the largest entrepreneurs, the employees actually benefit as well from the salaries and the jobs that they get. A second dimension is those firms that supply to the firms of these entrepreneurs. And here, what is being shown is that the wealth created by these entrepreneurs benefits the suppliers as well, because they end up supplying to these firms. A third way of looking at it is the foreign exchange revenue, which you all would understand matters for macro stability, because those revenues affect our current account deficit and in turn macro stability. What you see here is that the wealth created by these entrepreneurs also correlates strongly with foreign exchange revenue. A final aspect is what goes to the citizens through the government as the taxes that are paid by these entrepreneurs. What is being shown here is the direct taxes paid by these entrepreneurs, which clearly is an underestimate because there are various other indirect taxes that are also paid. But what is important here is a strong correlation between the wealth created by these entrepreneurs and the direct taxes that are paid. Because, and this goes back to what the Honorable Prime Minister, said in his Independence Day speech, unless wealth is created, it cannot be distributed, and for distribution, it's basically taxes that are the primary instrument. Now, as I had mentioned, that India dominated economic activity for 3/4 of known economic history, and that doesn't happen by accident, it requires design. So what is that element of the design that indeed led to such economic dominance? The economic survey posits that it is the combination of the invisible hand of the market supported by the hand of trust, which is what leads to wealth creation. And here there are important pieces of literature which we actually quote from. Take, for instance, to support the idea of the invisible hand of the market from Arthashastra, which says the root of wealth is economic activity, and lack of it brings material distress. In the absence of fruitful economic activity, both current prosperity and future growth are in danger of destruction. In fact, the Arthashastra also commends the king to actually remove all obstacles to economic activity, which you would think about in contemporary times as economic freedom. If you look at the hand of trust, in the same chapter from which I quoted from the Tirukkural, Tiruvalluvar says, wealth yields righteousness and joy, the wealth acquired capably without causing any harm, which is about the hand of trust. So now I'm going to provide evidence on these aspects. Before that, let me just mention that the economic survey, building on this idea that the combination of the invisible hand of the market has to be combined with the hand of trust, introduces this idea that trust is a public good which gets enhanced with greater use. Consider the example of water as a public good. As we use it more, it gets depleted. But the beauty about trust is that the more it gets used, the more the value of it gets enhanced. Of course, conversely, it's also true that if it does not get used, then the value of it declines as well. That's the characteristic of a public good, which gets enhanced with greater use. In trying to pursue wealth creation in the Indian economy, the economic survey brings out 10 main ideas, which is first that wealth creation benefits all, the invisible hand of the market enables wealth creation, trust is a public good that increases with use, grassroots entrepreneurs, which we basically have evidence in the second chapter of the survey, using evidence from 504 districts in India, showing that grassroots entrepreneurs indeed create wealth in their districts. Pro-business policies, those that provide equal opportunity, are important for wealth creation. In order for wealth creation, it's also important to remove some of the anachronistic government interventions that have actually subsisted. Job creation, which is very important in the Indian context today, can be furthered significantly by integrating Assemble in India for the World into the Make in India campaign. The survey goes into great detail about how the ease of doing business can be enhanced by implementing specific suggestions to bring India within the first 50 in the rankings in the World Bank's ease of doing business ranking. The survey highlights that the banking sector, when you compare the size of the economy, is at this point subscale, and that is something that we need to think about. Finally, in keeping with the spirit of making economics relate to the common person, the economic survey brings the idea of thalinomics, which is the economics of a plate of food in India. Let me give you some evidence about the role of the invisible hand of the market in generating wealth. Of course, India's GDP and GDP per capita have increased significantly after liberalization. In this chart, what is being shown is the wealth that is created from the perspective of the stock market. What is quite interesting to note here, what is being plotted, is every milestone that the Sensex achieved. 5,000 milestone. If you notice the first half, which is the phase 1 accelerated growth, while it took about 170 months for the first milestone of 5,000 to be reached, the subsequent milestones were reached much, much faster. And that's the first phase of accelerated growth. By the way, this is not just because of a scale effect, it is the increase in the growth rates that actually accounts for this acceleration. A second phase from 2007 to 2014, when it took about 80 months for the next milestone to be achieved. And then a third phase of revival again, where the milestones are being reached faster. Also notice that the last milestone from 35,000 to 40,000 has taken a little longer, which is actually also reflective of the slowdown in growth that we talked about. A few other examples, if you look at it from various sectors, this shows the banking sector. When the entry of private sector banks was allowed in the early 90s, look at the growth rate in the penetration of credit before and the penetration after. It's significantly higher. Similarly, another example, take the mutual fund sector, which when it was opened up in early 2000s by breaking up UTI, look at the growth rates before and after. Again, significant difference. Another way of looking at the same thing, the impact of economic freedom and openness on generating wealth, is to distinguish various sectors. Here, an apples-to-apples comparison is being made within the transport sector. Take an open sector like roads and contrast it with a closed sector like railways. And here what is being shown is the freight traffic. The freight traffic for the open sector increased at exponential rates, much higher than the closed sector, and this effect is even more pronounced when you look at it from the perspective of passenger traffic, where you again find the open sector increasing at much higher rates than the closed sector. So in sum, these and other evidences that are there in the first chapter clearly articulate that the invisible hand of the market really and openness enables actually growth not only at the aggregate level but also at the sectoral level. The other important pillar, as I just mentioned, is the hand of trust. If you look at the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, 2011 is when India actually was at its low. If you correlate that with a different way of looking at the same thing, which is there is a break here provided in 2011 when the report on the 2G spectrum allocation was brought out. If you look at it, what is clear here is that connected companies, which are basically which is the line that is shown in red, vis-a-vis those that actually, the purple line for the BSE Sensex, before 2011, the connected companies actually earned much higher returns. But then there is a scissor-like movement after 2011 with the same connected companies earning lower returns since then. This is an important aspect because it relates to trust in the system and the difference between the pro-business policies that enable opportunity versus pro-crony policies that can favor incumbents, which is the Chapter 3 of the Economic Survey. Another way of showing the same thing is the quality of financial statements. The Reserve Bank of India had, pointed out some of the large defaulters. What this chart shows is the financial statement quality of these large defaulters, 11 of them, by comparing it with the median financial statement quality in 3 years, 2012, 2013, and 2014. The median level, which captures basically what is the level of financial statement quality for the average firms, vis-a-vis that for these 11 large defaulters. And what is very clear is that even in 2012 to 2014, these indicators of financial statement quality were giving some signs. And it is important in the context of trust to actually keep in mind that when there are large firms whose financial statements are not as dependable, then it creates a trust deficit for other firms as well, because the average investor then starts thinking about the financial statement quality of every firm. A different way of looking at the same thing is by looking at the wealth erosion by willful defaulters, which is being compared with some of the large subsidy heads in the budget. One way of saying this is that if this money were not lost, we could have been spending almost double on our social sector, which benefits the common person. For instance, if you look at the health, education, and social protection, the spending that is done is almost the same as that for willful defaulters. Or, if this money possibly had been spent on improving the capital, if this hadn't been lost, it could have possibly been spent on capital expenditures in the railways, which again benefits the common person by enabling, that person better travel. I was actually talking about telltale signs, for willful defaulters. Here what is being done is a comparison between willful defaulters versus non-defaulters in the top panel, and willful defaulters versus distressed defaulters in the bottom panel. And here, if you look at in terms of the disclosure of related party transactions, the promoter holding that is pledged, or the loans that are given to related parties, clearly willful defaulters differ significantly from either non-defaulters or distressed defaulters. And these are signs that actually, again, important, which I'll come back to later. One other way of looking at this is the way, take one particular bank that has actually declared a particular borrower as a defaulter, and does another bank reflect the same? This, if you see, from 2014 onwards till 2019, this has secularly increased, which is consistent with the cleanup of the banking system that has happened over the last 5 years. Now let me spend some time on the important instruments for wealth creation that we must rely on. This chart here shows the widespread new firm creation that is happening at the level of districts in India. Think about the movie Band Baja Barat, where this protagonist Shruti Kakkad actually says that "Main India ki best wedding planner banungi." It looks like from this map clearly that there are many Shrutis like that all over the districts in India. In fact, those people in the south would also be able to relate with the movie Aha Kalyanam, where again Shruti is the same protagonist. What is important is also to take into account that these entrepreneurs at the grassroots level are also helping the local economy, because an improvement in new firm creation also leads to GDP growth. An increase of 10% in the new firm creation translates into an increase of 1.8% in the GDP growth in the district. If you go by the World Bank data for new firm creation, it has picked up pace since 2014. The annual growth rate up till 2014 if you compare with 2006, was 3.8%, while that after 2014 is 12.2%. And what is quite important actually to keep in mind here is that the new firm creation is particularly pronounced in the services sector, which also is consistent with a macro fact that we know very well that in the service sector that is an important contributor to value added in India. So the micro data using entrepreneurship at the district level is consistent with the macro data saying that services sector is a really important contributor to value added. I spoke about some of the pro-crony policies, and I'm now going to contrast it with pro-business policies that enable opportunity. What is being shown here is the churn in the index when we compare the 1986 index vis-a-vis the 1997 index, which is pre-liberalization versus after post-liberalization. What is quite clear is that if a firm was in the Sensex pre-liberalization, it could expect to be in the Sensex for a long, long time. In contrast, after liberalization, there is significant churn. By the time 9 years happen, about a third of the firms that actually were there in the Sensex originally are present, which shows the churn that is happening in terms of firms, in terms of sectors, the technologies that they bring. This is a very important point for wealth creation, because when you have new technologies, new firms coming in, not only do they benefit by bringing in these technologies, but more importantly, they keep the incumbents on their toes by providing them healthy competition. Now, this is also apparent if you look at the way the Sensex has evolved in terms of the various sectors that are dominating the Sensex. Notice that if you looked at in 1986, it's the materials sector and the consumer discretionary sector which was a large contributor to the Sensex in terms of the value added. But if you look at it today, their presence has actually decreased significantly. A sector like the information technology or the financial services sector, which was not even existent in 1986, now has significant presence in the Sensex, which is basically consistent with the churn that is happening post-liberalization. So this is a very important aspect of wealth creation, which is pro-business policies that provide opportunities to the incumbents, to the entrants to be able to compete on a level playing field with the incumbents. Another important aspect of wealth creation is basically looking at laws that possibly have lost their relevance at this point in time, and look at the unintended consequences that can be created when government intervenes where there is no need for such a thing to happen. One example that I'm going to pick is the Essential Commodities Act, which was enacted in 1955. The Indian economy in 1955 was a very different economy to what it is today. The 1955 India was one that had suffered the ravages of famines, food shortages, and had just emerged after the Second World War and independence, and therefore the kind of market failures that the economy faced at that point in time were very different from what it is today. Today, India is an economy where food is produced in more than demand, so food shortages are a thing of the past. So it's very important, therefore, to make a distinction between storage and hoarding. If traders are unable to store, then they will not be able to basically smooth prices. So this distinction needs to be made. We should not be looking at every storer as necessarily a hoarder. And that is what is important if we have to think about bringing in more investment into the food processing industry, into the storage sector, then this view has to change. And here's the evidence is quite important. If you look at the prices of potato and onion, onion, as you know, suffered a production shock, but the imposition of stock limits does not really have much of an effect on the volatility in prices. So potato is shown as a control here compared with onion. You know, the imposition of stock limits does not have much of an impact. Now, this is not something that is, you know, a recent phenomenon. If you go to other instances, if you look at the stock limits that were imposed on gram, you know, in 2006, 2007, or if you look at sugar versus salt, the same pattern is obtained there as well. So the point that is being made here is that some of these anachronistic laws that were actually created at different point in time when the Indian economy was different need to be rethought, and possibly thereby, you know, the cost that they create for the economy can be minimized. As you all would acknowledge, job creation is a very important aspect of the Indian economy, and here's where exports can play a critical role. What this slide does is compares India's performance in exports vis-a-vis China and splits that into the effect of specialization, which is picking a few sectors and really digging deep into it, versus diversification. What you notice here is that the entire difference in export performance between India versus China is accounted for by specialization. China has specialized in the labor-intensive sectors and has thereby created lots of jobs, while India has not been able to do so. India's performance on diversification across product categories is quite similar to China. In other words, when we look at our presence in various product categories, we are doing very similar to China, but the main difference comes from the difference in specialization. And so what is important really is today for us to focus on specializing and picking especially the labor-intensive sectors, which are actually, you know, our comparative advantage given the labor force that we have. And for this, the sixth chapter in the economic survey, fifth chapter, makes a very, very clear case for focusing on these labor-intensive sectors. To give you an example, take the iPhone, which is, you know, assembled in China. If you take every iPhone, China, the value added that it creates on every iPhone is about $8.50. Which dwarfs compared to the value added that, you know, Japan or the United States actually creates in an iPhone. But the important effect that China actually has is the scale, which is that every iPhone, almost every iPhone, at least till recently, was assembled in China. So when you take a per unit, which is about $8.50, but multiply it with a large scale, you get exports that are significant, and in the process, significant jobs are created as well. The economic survey this year has actually done an estimation that if India were to actually follow a similar path, and I'll come to why this is the opportune moment, that India can create significant opportunities. Export of network products is expected to be about $7 trillion worldwide by 2025. Network products are those that are actually manufactured across global value chains. These include industries like telecom equipment, mobile phones, of course, you know, photographic machinery, etc. There are 6 sectors which actually form part of these network products. By focusing on this particular sector, which, as I said, has a market of about $7 trillion worldwide by 2025, India can generate about a quarter of the value added that is required for it to achieve on the export side, the $5 trillion economy, and quite importantly, generate about 4 crore well-paid jobs by 2025 and 8 crore jobs by 2030. This is about basically enabling imports of components in India, assembling them and exporting it without being, you know, judgmental about the process, just focusing on generating jobs through exports of this nature. Why is this opportunity now? Because if you look at the countries that actually, you know, examples of Japan, Korea, China, they are now at a phase where they basically, their presence in these network products is declining. And therefore, the opportunity for India is significant. Together with the current trade environment, with the trade war that is going on, this is possibly the best opportunity for India to actually, you know, really latch on to this particular benefit for job creation. As I had mentioned earlier, one of the very important aspects of wealth creation is economic freedom, and here the ease of doing business is really critical. While India has certainly made strides in improving its performance in the ease of doing business, especially we've gone up from being ranked 142 in 2014 to 63rd in 2019, it still is the case that India lags behind on a few areas, which is ease of starting business, registering property, paying taxes, and enforcing contracts. To give you some illustrative examples, if you want to open a restaurant in Delhi, you need about 45 documents to obtain the necessary license from Delhi Police. If you want to buy a gun, you need 19 documents. If you want to set up a new firm in India, it takes about 18 days, on average 18 days, with about 10 procedures that can be often cumbersome. Just contrast it to the best in business, which is New Zealand. In New Zealand, it takes half a day, you fill one form, and boom, your business is started. So this chapter makes very, very specific suggestions that need to be focused on so that India can really improve its rank and get into the top 50 in the EODB rankings. A very important dimension of any economy is the banking sector. And the Indian banking sector, despite the enormous size of our economy, we are currently the 5th largest economy, is subscale. What this chart shows is the number of banks that are there in the global 100, global top 100, country-wise. China leads the table. India comes quite far behind with one bank in the top 100. Even countries like Singapore and Sweden, which are a fraction of our size, they have triple the number of large banks. Now, if our banking sector were proportional to the size of the economy, India should have had 6 banks in the global top 100, and by the time we become a $5 trillion economy, we should have 8 banks in the top 100. Now, there are other ways of looking at the same thing, which is if you plot the GDP per capita, this here actually shows the size of the economy and the number of banks. What you notice here clearly is that India is a negative outlier. That's the line of fit is where basically, India should be. If India had a proportionate banking sector, India seems a negative outlier, with China being a positive outlier. Notice the United States is on the line. Another way of looking at the same thing is, compare how developed the economy is and the penetration of credit in the economy. What is being plotted here on the x-axis is the GDP per capita and the private credit to GDP on the y-axis. Here again, India is a negative outlier. If India's banking sector were proportional to the level of advancedness of the economy, our credit penetration should have been about 90%, which is about 80% more than what it is today. One other way of looking at it, because the concern could come up that this is all because of our population. We have a very large population, and therefore the penetration of the banking sector is low. Even if you control for the effect of population, clearly countries that actually are more populated have lower credit penetration. But even taking that into account, India still has significantly lower credit penetration. So the point being made here is that compared to the size of the economy, at this point, the economy is the banking sector needs to scale up and become proportional to the size of the economy. And in this, there have been several reports that have looked at the banking sector, starting from the Narasimhan Committee 1 and 2, the Rajan Committee, the P. Naik Committee, which have made recommendations which can be considered. The economic survey gives one key idea, and this goes back, when I did my BTech in electrical engineering, my BTech thesis was on using neural networks for electrical engineering, which is an application of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Today, that has actually become really, really critical in the banking sector. So the idea that the economic survey is advocating is a public sector banking network which will enable analytics, artificial intelligence and machine learning for better decisions. If you remember, when I talked about trust, I focused on several leading indicators, be it financial statement quality, be it the differences between willful defaulters and others, and these were actually indicators that were flashing 2-3 years back. And this is something that data can really pick up, just plain simple data. Of course, artificial intelligence and machine learning can do a far better job in trying to actually identify patterns that can really avoid this phenomenon. So the idea that is being advocated here is to build a network use the data within the frameworks, legal frameworks of data, use the data across the various public sector banks to really enable better decision making, especially on corporate lending. And that is where really the data can be quite critical. The NBFC sector, as you all know, has actually gone through some recent difficulties. So the economic survey builds a health index to track financial fragility in the NBFC sector. And if you notice here, this is the index for the housing finance sector, which shows that from 2014 itself, there were early signs which could have actually been picked up. This is another idea that has been built up in the economic survey to try and actually enable policymakers to be able to track the financial fragility in the NBFC sector. Last but not the least, in the previous survey, we had made a humble effort to try and relate economics with the common person using behavioral economics. In this survey, we actually are introducing Thalinomics, which is the economics of a plate of food in India. There is no better way, at least in the opinion of the team of the economic survey, than to relate economics to the common person by using the plate of food that a person consumes every day. So what the survey has done is looked across 28 states, the different meals that people consume, taken each component, which is cereals, pulses, vegetables, even the garnishing that happens from turmeric to garlic to others, and really calculated what is the price of a thali that a person would pay across 28 states. And what is quite interesting to note is that if you look at the trend in the thali prices that prevailed to 2015-16, if that trend had prevailed, as you notice in the chart on the left, there has been a clear moderation in the in prices. Compared to that trend, an average industrial household that has 5 individuals and eats 2 vegetarian thalis a day has benefited by about rupees 10,000, on an annual basis, which basically captures the benefits that they've got. Notice here that the prices of thalis this year have increased. So this index is indeed capturing what is happening on the ground as well. And what you see on the right is a measure of affordability of the thali, which is what percentage of the earnings of an average industrial worker does it go in just having 2 thalis for a household of 5 individuals. What is very clear here is that since 2006-2007, affordability has increased significantly due to various policy measures. So the next few charts I'm going to show is for the different states across across various parts of India. This is basically the intention here is that whether you are here in Lutyens, Delhi having a dinner table conversation, or you are in a roadside dhaba somewhere in the hinterland, you can have debates about the question about saying has a thali become costlier or has it become cheaper? You can also ask questions like, is the vegetarian thali actually cheaper or the non-vegetarian? Where has been the inflation greater? Which components have really contributed to increase or decrease in the price of thali? Questions like these that can really spur quote-unquote healthy debate can now be indulged in using this index of thali prices that the Thalinomics builds. Once again, let me thank you very much for your patient listening.